This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 99. How Marx was wrong on revolution.
Hello, welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, ever wondered what Karl Marx was really about? He's known as a revolutionary. He's associated with tyrants through the generations. But whilst he might have wanted a fight against the imbalance of capitalism, he presumably didn't want to see it replaced with communist dictators. Or did he? Well, today we try and understand the man and his theories, the way he saw the world a couple of centuries ago now. That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Now, it is 200 years since Karl Marx was born, and he's been a divisive character ever since. Many might accept his theories on a class struggle between the workers and the capitalists, but most would be against his assumption that the problem could be overcome through revolution, an assumption that's been used as an excuse by tyrannical leaders over the years, from Lenin and Stalin through to Castro and Kim Jong-un. So are we really facing a class struggle between workers and capitalists? Well, let's start with the basis of Marx's theory, Steve, how capitalists make a profit. And basically, it's the difference between what workers get paid and what people pay them for the products, isn't it, more or less?
Yeah, that's more or less what it was. And the interesting thing about Marx is that there were plenty of people who made that same sort of argument, and it came from the labour theory of value, which we initially got. The beginnings of that we got from Smith. And one thing which I'm emphatic about pointing out to people is that wasn't the very first theory of where surplus came from. But by surplus, I mean you get more outputs than inputs. Okay, we every year that's capitalism's nature. There's more physical outputs than there are inputs every year, and there's a growing quality of those inputs over time. There's no argument about that happening in capitalism. The question is, how does it happen? And the very first explanation for that was given by the physiocrats. Really, you can take it right back to not just to Quenet and Cantillon. You can take it back to William Petty, and basically saying what we're doing is exploiting the free gift of the land. Now, frankly, that's more correct than the labour theory of value. So we got to Adam Smith, and Smith interacted with the physiocrats. I wouldn't say trained by them, interacted with them, met Quenet, and he came back and he started by saying, in fact, it's all courtesy of labour. That he didn't say labour is the source of value. What he said was the division of labour increases the amount of value. So if you have a job which is done by one worker and you divide that job into two segments, each done by a worker specialised on that particular segment, you'll increase the total amount produced because of specialisation, and that's what gives us the increase in value. But he never actually said that was the only source of value. Now, Marx came along. In fact, Smith actually said that the farmers make more profit because, and this is actually in energy sense that I think in these days valid. He said a farmer makes a larger profit because not only his farm workers but his cattle are labourers. And that's actually correct in an energy point of view. Anyway, Marx comes along and says, no, it's all due to labour, and it's due to the essential difference between labour and any other commodity is that when you buy a commodity like an apple, you pay for the apple, you get the apple, and the apple has no say in what you do with it. When you hire a worker, you pay for the worker what the worker requires to be reproduced, the means of subsistence, and then you can get the worker to work for as long as you like according to the labour contracts of the time. And Smith, most of the examples that Marx gave had a person working a 12-hour day, which was pretty common during the early days of the Industrial Revolution, 12 hours a day down mill, the old Monty Python line. I was at 26 hours down mill, I forgot.
If you were lucky,
If you're lucky. But the 12 hours a day, and in fact the amount of time that it takes to produce the means of subsistence might be 6 hours a day. So the difference between the 12 hours you actually work and the 6 hours that's needed in a generic sense to reproduce your means of subsistence, that was the source of profit. No. So that became Marx's original explanation. And then he added to that the proposition that over time competition between capitalists would mean that they would bring in technology to try to get an advantage, but because of this inherent problem, and I'm using problem in inverted commas, that labour is the only source of value. As you added more capital relative to the labour, your denominator to give you what Marx called the rate of profit, and it wasn't technically a rate of profit, the term he used. He had the amount of surplus being generated, which is the gap between the 12 hours and the 6, so that's the surplus. Divide that by the inputs, which were what you've got to pay for the worker, which is the 6 hours, plus the depreciation of machinery. He said, as time goes on, you're adding more and more machinery. That will drive down the rate of profit, and he had a number of what he called countervailing tendencies that would slow that process down. But overall, what he saw was an inexorable trend to a declining rate of profit. And that declining rate of profit would therefore mean that capitalists would continue squeezing workers harder, workers would fight back, you'd finally get a class struggle of the ultimate confrontation, and bang, out of that you'd have the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a phrase that Marx used, and you'd go transition to socialism. So he saw this, yeah.
I mean, a lot of it is rubbish, isn't it, clearly? But you can see bits of it, which, I mean, for example, squeezing people on wages, but that tends to be a factor of just how many jobs there are around, doesn't it? And similarly, the value of goods. I mean, if you look at what people are prepared to pay is nothing to do with how much a good costs to produce. It's what people are prepared to pay, which is it's brand, it's how you position, how it's positioned. It's the value people are placing on it.
Well, this is what you're putting forward is a subjective idea about what sets the price people are willing to pay. And this is where the classical school of thought, which Marx is part of, and by the way, Marx is, in my opinion, the greatest of the classical economists. So I'm going to be very critical of him in this podcast. But having read everything he wrote on economics, and by the way, when I did that for my master's thesis, when I finished, I thought I'd stack up the books and see just how much paper I had to read everything he'd written on economics, leaving out all the articles he wrote on things like the 18th Premier of Louis Napoleon and a whole range of other works, all the writing he wrote for the New York Times, etc., etc. He made a substantial part of his meagre livings he made from being a journalist. He wrote a total of 3 feet thick worth of paper. Right. And stacking up the economic and philosophical manuscripts, the wage, labour and capital, yada, yada, yada. It came just below the height of a tennis net, which is my other obsession, as you know. So, having read all that, you get an appreciation for the enormous scholarship that lay in his thinking. And what he did as well is to systematize the classical school argument that it isn't subjective, that value is not subjective, a value is objective. And his basic argument was, I can paraphrase it for the podcast, but if you consider a brand new iPhone 10, something of that nature, then yes, the early adopters will pay a huge price to get the machine before anybody else, and that uniqueness, in a sense, of the commodity. It's actually not a commodity. When these things first come out, people are buying iPhones which are produced using other commodities, right, but they're not using iPhones themselves to make commodities.
Right. So they become a commodity over time as we get used to it.
That's right, yeah. And as that happens, then and this is something you can find in the neoclassical theory as well. In the long run, as they put it, you get to the stage where cost is determined solely by cost of production, and they include a small markup. The price is determined by cost of production. You mean? So it gets to a stage where the pressures have pushed it down so far. Really, people will pay the minimum they can get away with, and the minimum they'll get away with, because it is a commodity, is basically how much it costs to produce plus a bit of profit. And that was the classical school in general had position, and Ricardo was very emphatic about it, and so was Smith. And what they both had was an inadequate theory of relative prices based on the amount of labour time going in. So having lost the energy component of the thinking of the physiocrats, they reduced everything rather than to land, which is what the physiocrats did. They reduced it to labour, and they said things exchange relative to the amount of labour that goes into producing them. No. So Smith had a famous example of the beaver. I've forgotten the other animal all of a sudden. A beaver and a deer, I think it was. And if it took twice as much labour to kill the beaver as to kill the deer, then the beaver should exchange for one beaver should exchange for 2 deer. And Ricardo elaborated that and said, well, if the weapon needed to kill the beaver took more labour to produce than the weapon needed to kill the deer, then you'd have to give something, inverted commas, for the profits of stock. But they never actually systematised it, and they never explained where the profit still comes from if you buy and sell at the value. And Marx's advance at this stage was to say, well, it's because you're buying this very, very special, very unique commodity called labour time, where you pay its cost of production, which is subsistence, but what you can exploit out of it is its capacity to work, which can go on for longer than the length of time needed to produce the means of subsistence. Bang, here's profit. Yada, haven't I explained it all very well? And then he tied it up with the argument that you would have this tendency for more machinery over time. Therefore, because the profit only comes from the labour component, an increasing what Marx called organic composition of capital means the rate of profit declines, and then I've come a class struggle, Bormann, the wonderful socialist revolution, which of course was a total catastrophe.
It's good. If there's lots of jobs available, then obviously salaries are going to be lower because there's a bigger supply of the labour market. If salaries are lower, by this theory, then products would be cheaper as well.
Yeah, and this is what Marx had a lot of this reasoning in his thinking. And just for example, to talk about the actual value of labour power, a lot of Marxists equated value of labour power, like the subsistence wage, to the minimum, to the actual wage that was received. And you'll find this leading Marxist, and now long dead, like Ronald Meek and Morris Dobbs, often made that case. But when you look at Marx himself, and I've read everything he ever wrote on economics, he mentioned value of labour power and wage 7 times in the one sentence or paragraph. And every time he did, he said the value of labour alias the minimum wage. In other words, workers, the minimum they're going to get is that for subsistence. They're likely to get more. And this is something which Marxists haven't properly integrated into their thinking. But the main point that I want to make about where Marx went wrong, and I've done this in a podcast or in a written piece for my subscribers, which I hope will be published on Russia Today shortly, is that he developed a philosophical explanation rather than just the unique characteristics of labour. He developed another explanation in the middle of the 1857-58, but I think it was probably in January, when by sheer accident, I think it was Otto Brer dropped into Marx's house, which I think at the time was in Chelsea, and he had somehow, Marx had given away his copy of Hegel's Logic to somebody else, and bang, here it is again. And this is the point when Marx is avidly rereading everything he's ever read on economics beforehand, all the Smith, Ricardo, Quenet, Petty, Senior, yada, yada, yada that he read when he first converted from a philosopher to an economist. He's back reading Hegel again. And I should have brought up I might see if I can bring up a couple of segments to give you a quote from the writings, but he was, as he's reading these books, he's writing notes. And before he got given the copy of Hegel's Logic back again, it's like reading Ricardo. Rather more eloquence, rather more fire, but very similar logic to and language to Ricardo. Then he starts reading Hegel, and all of a sudden it's all the stuff about opposites and foreground and background and unities, etc., etc. And as I mentioned in the column on Patreon, it's almost like a Hunter S. Thompson moment. The old Gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson. Mm. Yeah, okay. You're reading him at one stage. You can tell he's been taking cocaine, and then wham, he's stoned, and there's this complete change. Yeah, next paragraph, bang. Well, that was exactly what it was like in reading the Grundrisse. It's about page 200 in the book became about 1,000 pages long in a Penguin edition when it first came out back in the 70s when I read it in the late, I think in the 80s when I was doing my master's thesis. It's about page 250. Where he's obviously got the copy of Hegel, and bang, the whole language changes, just like going from cocaine to marijuana in the hands of, or maybe the other way around, given the clarity. From marijuana to cocaine is probably a better direction to describe it. But the sudden clarity, we're using this philosophical language. And a lot of Marxists, including prominent ones like Paul Sweezy, completely dismissed this and described it as Marx coquetting, which is a French term meaning flirting with the Hegelian mode of expression, but basically you can ignore all that stuff. Well, they were totally wrong, because I believe that using Hegel's philosophical logic, Marx both developed a far stronger foundation for classical economics and rejected the labour theory of value, which gave him an existential crisis, because without the labour theory of value and without the argument of the declining rate of profit, there was no necessity for socialism.
But I thought we just spent a large part of the last 10 minutes talking about the how the labour value of theory might have some legs.
Yeah, but it hasn't got unique legs. See, the thing about the argument about the unique characteristics of labour, say that it's an argument by exclusion. No other product has the difference between commodity and commodity power. Labour has this difference between labour and labour power, and therefore that's the unique characteristics, only reason for a surplus. You can't find any other. And you'd pin people like Paul Sweezy saying that, there's no way that we can imagine that machinery has an occult capacity to produce, to give more value than it contains. So the argument was that labour would give a surplus, machinery would not. Now, what Marx developed when he reread Hegel was applying Hegel's version of dialectics to the question of value in capitalism. Hegel's also written in economics, something that I haven't read myself. I have to go back and read it at some point. But this again gets very muddy because most people. Actually, I'll ask you. And have you read my piece for the Patreon blog yet?
Yes, I have.
See, you cheated.
Yeah.
Oh, damn. Okay. Well, you've got to say it. What do people think when they think dialectic? They think of three words, and they are.
Oh, well, there you are. You see, you're testing how well I've read it. So,
it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Right.
Okay. Now, I said try that 5 times fast without sounding like Daffy Duck.
Difficult.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Yeah. Well, that actually doesn't belong to Hegel or Marx at all. It's another philosopher called Fichte. And when I was reading. A bit my own personal story here. I was very skeptical about the whole idea that machinery didn't produce value. And I remember having discussions with my lefty friends at university back in the early 70s when I led the political economy dispute at Sydney University. And we were walking around the campus of Sydney University, which, as you know, has got a sort of high point of land just outside Sydney CBD. And this was 1972. And there's just far as you can see, there are cranes on building skyscrapers. It was an absolute building boom at that stage. And I remember remarking to one of my friends then that I have a very hard time imagining that all those cranes aren't adding value somehow. Now, typical bunch of lefties, we'd led a student revolt in 1973. At the end of it, we spent Sydney's summer, and boy, this is a sacrifice. Sydney summer, locked in a room in the sandstone-built quadrangle of Sydney University, reading Marx's Capital together. So here we are reading the whole thing. Yeah, a bunch of lefties. What else do you do?
Yeah, well, you could be down at the beach probably.
Indeed.
With suntan women or that sort of thing. But no, lock yourself in the basement. Yeah.
Here we are. Okay. And I'm reading it saying, okay, I want a really good explanation for Marx as to why machinery doesn't produce value. And then having been trained in mainstream economics where it's all about marginal cost and marginal utility and the market system equilibrating between the two, Marx started giving this explanation talking about use value and exchange value and saying that there was a gap between the two. They were incommensurable was the expression he used. And what he said was if you imagine an early and primitive societies, or you imagine, say, first contact between a European culture and a Aboriginal culture somewhere, then one group will have a product they can produce that the other has no idea of how the product is made. Now, the classic example, of course, is Manhattan. You buy Manhattan Island for 43 beads. That story is more complicated than it's made out to be, but that was the price paid for the Dutch to buy Manhattan off the Indians, the island of Manhattan. Now, of course, the Indians would not have known how to make glass, so glass beads, elaborately coloured glass beads, they're actually trading beads, look like pretty hot stuff. So you can imagine the subjective valuation of those being enormous, and therefore, 43 glass beads for Manhattan. What Marx said is, over time, you continue reproducing that trade, both sides get some knowledge of how the other produces whatever technology they have uniquely, and both sides also start to produce some of those goods for the purpose of trade. They're not producing it for consumption. They're not losing any utility themselves to give them away. So over time, you start to distinguish the use value of a commodity from its exchange value, and then its exchange value sets the price. Now, that, in Marx's philosophical terms, is using Hegel's dialectic, and that says that you start from the idea of any what he called unity has to exist inside a context. And if we're talking about society, then the context is society. The unity is anything that exists inside that society. Now, if you imagine a commodity, then a commodity has two characteristics, fundamental characteristics: exchange value, its cost of production; exchange value, what it sells for; and utility, what you can use it for. And what Hegel argued is that the society will focus upon some particular aspect of that unity, and in capitalism, what you focus upon is the exchange value, because you're trying to make a numerical profit out of it. So you focus upon the exchange value. That doesn't eliminate the use value; it just puts it into the background. And so the unity, I use this dog bone analogy. You've got this unity embedded inside society. Society focuses upon one aspect, making that the foreground. That necessarily turns the remainder of that unity into the background. You therefore get a tension between the two. And that was the basic foundation for Hegel's philosophy of change, which was, I think, a very rich way of analysing any a system that evolves over time, and that's what Marx found himself applying. And he said, the commodity is the essential unity in capitalism. Capitalism focuses upon the exchange value. That pushes the use value into the background. The foreground element determines the price. The background element determines that the exchange actually is desired. And there's a tension between the two. He then applies it to labour and says, well, labour, exchange value, cost of production, means of subsistence, that's what you pay for it. Use value is what the buyer exploits. And because the two are incommensurable, normally when you and I buy a good as a consumer, we have a subjective utility we're getting out of it. But in production, it's an objective utility. You want to get X hours of labour out of a worker, you've got to pay Z hours in terms of time. There's a gap between the two because they're incommensurable, and the gap is positive. You make a profit out of that. And I thought it was a brilliant explanation, but exactly the same argument applied to machinery.
So, okay, let me try and get my head around some of this. So, are we now saying then, because when we were talking about, a utility gets down to the lowest price, and the lowest price is largely determined by the cost of labour. You start to add machines to that, then the cost of the machine. I mean, you might have, interest payments on the loan for buying that machine, but ultimately the machine's not costing too much to run apart from the cost of power. So that's not going to increase the price too much. It's still going to be the cost of labour, which is the variable element of all of this, isn't it? So I mean, the cost of the machine isn't going to add a great deal of value and push up the price too much if you're working on the basis that the price always gets down to the lowest level. But now you're saying, well, it's not that. There's also the utility. It's what you're getting out of it as a consumer, which means you're not necessarily going to pay the minimum price. You're going to pay the price that's
what you get is an argument about whether you can get when you get a surplus out of inputs to production, which went from being one about the unique characteristics of labour to one that's about characteristics that all commodities share. And Marx actually made this statement numerous times. He said that the capitalist, when he makes a profit out of labour, exploits the common characteristics of all commodities. He pays their exchange value, he exploits their use value. And the gap between the two is where the profit comes from.
Yeah.
Now, you apply exactly the same argument to machinery. If you pay the exchange value, the cost of production of the machine, you exploit its use value, which is another incommensurable quantity. And Marx actually says this. He says there are the use value in production, the use value of your input and the exchange value of your input are two incommensurable magnitudes. Now, magnitude does not mean quality, and I see a lot of Marxists try to wobble out of this by saying machinery plays a qualitative role in production rather than a quantitative. What Marx gave when he developed this argument was a rationale for saying any input to production can be a source of surplus, not just labour. And this is the intriguing thing about it is that having read this argument in Capital and to me, saying to my colleagues at the time in this discussion group that this is an argument that labour alone is not the source of surplus, they basically ridiculed me, which is a typical attitude, typical reaction to having your ideas challenged, I've found. So when I did my master's thesis, I thought, well, I'm going to find where Marx actually first discovered this concept. And that meant reading in chronological order everything in Marx written in economics, starting from the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, which he wrote in a garret in Paris as he read Ricardo and Smith and so on, right through to the final editions of Capital. And the discovery turned up in the Grundrisse on page 267 in a footnote of the Penguin edition, the footnote going on for more than a page. And you find him saying, so I find the actual statement, as he started to think in Hegelian terms, the Hegelian light bulb goes on when he says, is not value to be conceived as the unity of use value and exchange value? In and for itself is value as such the general form in opposition to use value and exchange value as the particular form, as I said. Does this have significance in economics? ? Now he's writing his notes to himself. And he's had this brainwave, and he then starts applying it, first of all, to labour, and easily gets exactly the same result he got by talking about the unique characteristics of labour. But then when he starts talking about machinery, he waffles around a fair bit all the way through. But he does say at one point, and this is where the light bulb confronts him with a huge challenge for his own beliefs. It also has to be postulated that the use value of the machine significantly greater than its value. And he left out the word is. I'll read that again. It also has to be postulated, which was not done above, that the use value of the machine significantly greater than its value, i.e. that its devaluation in the service of production is not proportional to its increasing effect on production. In other words, the machine can be a source of surplus. Now, I can imagine what went on in his head when that happened, because on occasions I've had a belief, like, for example, my belief that money wasn't destroyed when debt was repaid, a belief that when I developed my logic further, I realised I was wrong. And what do? And to me, what I had to do on the particular one is concede, okay, I'm wrong about that one, and I changed my logic and I admitted it. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I did it on that particular occasion. What Marx did was think, oh shit, I've lost the declining rate of profit. No, that can't be true. There must be some way I can reconcile the two. And then he goes through a huge amount of waffle, and that's the most polite way I can describe it. And the waffle manages to bury use value and exchange value into each other until such time as it looks like he's come out with the conclusion he wants. And the central contradiction in his own logic that he did at that point was he started off by saying part of this whole dialectic process is to say what is the opposite of the foreground aspect. So you've got your unity, you have foreground and background. You can also describe that as the entity and its opposite, which is a bit like the thesis, antithesis stuff that Fick goes on with. Am I losing you here?
You're a little bit. Let me pull you back a bit. Imagine because I'm thinking if I'm running a company. And it all gets back to this idea of, how would I maximise the profit if I was running a company? I would have thought, I know because I've been involved in business for many years. You don't want to become a utility. Everything you focus on is making sure that your product doesn't become a utility product, because then you really are getting squeezed on margins, and people are paying the lowest minimum price they can get away with. So you make sure you never get into that situation. So you always deploy your resources, whether it's machinery or people, to work on something else which will provide greater value to people so they will pay more. So you move off those utility products, create something else which surpasses it, and deliver what's perceived as greater value for the customer. So they pay more, so you get a bigger margin. And as you start to get squeezed on margins again, you do the same thing again.
And that's actually part of Marx's logic, because what he's doing at the early stage, and this again is where Marx is, by not understanding this whole use value, exchange value dialectic that's part of, I think, really pivotal to Marx's thinking, except for where it stuffed him up on the declining rate of profit, is that Marx treated his analysis a bit like an onion, where you work from the inner core and you get out further and further and you get more and more variations. And we're not thinking of Tony Abbott here, but the idea of a inner core and going wider and wider and wider. And at the very centre, he said, we're talking about things which are strictly commodities. We assume everything as a commodity, including labour. And he actually says that in, I think it's one of the preludes to Volume 1 of Capital. He says that we're going to assume that labour is paid its value, no more than its value. And then he says, we'll relax this assumption at a later stage. So what he had was an analysis of just strictly commodities, where you don't have the type of innovation you're talking about. But when you generalise it at a later point, you say, well, we can talk about new products, which is what your argument is largely about. You're always inventing something new. And a new product differs from a standard commodity in the sense that the new product has been produced using commodities, but it's not itself used as an input to commodities. So it's freed up from that constraint, and you can make those supernormal profits, as neoclassicals would describe them. But at a fundamental level, the explanation for surplus was this use value minus exchange value in production. And that's the point that Marx is talking about.
So if you're calling it supernormal profits, I'd say that every business is creating a supernormal profit, because no business, even utility companies, try and repackage their utilities in a way that they can create a profit, by by pricing schemes or whatever. They do something which is enhancing the value as far as the consumer.
Yeah, but it's still, you're still starting off. You've got to start from a basis of where do you make your surplus from, and that's why I come back to saying it's really about exploiting the energy that we find for free in the universe. That's the ultimate explanation, which Marx's logic can handle, but he didn't actually include that in his own thinking.
So explain to me why labour wouldn't be a commodity, though. You made the point that people...
Labour is a commodity to begin with, but we said labour, and he actually in chapter 25 of volume 1 of Capital, he starts talking about the wage varying in a cycle, which is where my own model of the financial instability hypothesis came from, based on the work of Richard Goodwin. So he did start saying, even in Volume 1, he allowed that the wage could rise or fall over time, given the pressures of competition that capitalists had to do to get labour. Yeah. If you had a boom going on, of course, workers can demand a higher wage, so they're getting more than just subsistence. So he did have that idea of variability in there, but he started from saying, let's assume everything is paid for its value, sold at its value, and bought at its value. How do you make a profit? And his initial explanation was just this unique characteristic of labour, which would justify a declining rate of profit argument as well if there's an increase in capital intensity over time. But then he came up with this idea of use value and exchange value in general, and when you apply that to both machinery and labour, seeing those as the two critical inputs to production, you get the answer, well, they can both be a source of surplus, and therefore increasing organic composition of capital, as Marx called it, has no implications for the rate of surplus, has no implications for the rate of profit. And therefore, if you're a 19th century revolutionary, and you think you've proven that socialism has to come about, you've suddenly got a new proof that says, hang on a sec, maybe socialism doesn't have to come about. What the F do I do? And Marx, at that point, in my opinion, went through this process of fudging to try to make his two arguments seem consistent and completely stymied people using his analysis. But if you imagine at the same time, and when Marx was heavily involved in all the internationals and the conflict between the communists and the anarchists and all the various lefty groups that existed back in the 19th century England and Europe, imagine having come and say, comrades, I'm terribly sorry, I've just proven the revolution isn't necessarily going to happen.
Right.
I don't think that would have occurred, and it certainly didn't.
And he didn't do that, and that, of course, is what he's most remembered for, perhaps, this idea that we only get change through revolution, and it's, and the filthy capitalists will be the first against the wall. So had he changed his tune on that, maybe his name would have been used less by these tyrannical dictators. Well,
he would have been, if he'd actually changed the tune on that front, he would have been the basis of a very sensible rebirth of the classical method in the middle of the 1800s. But instead, he ossified it into the labour theory of value. And this is more technical, we need to get in a podcast, but if you start from the belief that labour is the only source of surplus, and then you have to explain how you have uniform rates of profit with industries that have different ratios of capital to labour, you get caught up in what's called the transformation problem. And this is it's an insoluble puzzle, and there are all sorts of attempts to solve the problem. They got more and more ludicrous with time. There's now a particular bunch of Marxists called TSS, which stands for temporal single system, I think it's called. Marx is still trying to prove the labour theory of value is right, and there are a bunch of irrelevant, pardon me, I like some of them, but the leading member, a guy called Alan Kleiman, he's a useless twerp, who's 3 years after the crisis proved why it occurred because of the declining rate of profit. Well, wow. In the 2008 crisis. But they've basically wasted their time. They're trying to solve what is actually a mathematically insoluble problem. And in that sense, rather than Marx being the leader of the revolution, he ended up being justifying the political revolution on false grounds. But analytically, Marxists became this side little sect, forever trying to get themselves consistent on this mathematical inconsistency called the transformation problem. So his legacy, to me, his legacy would be far greater as an intellectual if he'd admitted that he'd proven that there was no necessity for socialism. He didn't. So instead we have him as this huge political figure who's had, over the long term, bugger all impact upon economic theory. And I would rather reverse that and say, look, this idea he had about dialectics is actually a very solid foundation for a dynamic analysis of capitalism. It is not a basis explaining why revolution has to occur. In fact, it's an explanation why revolution wasn't necessary. But, of course, that's not what we've got. And I'm trying to extricate the good stuff of Marx from what I see as the bad stuff, which is both, of course, the political consequences, but, again, this very awkward and mathematically false analysis of capitalism.
Right. Well, we will have to revisit it again, won't we? And you can have another stab at trying to make me understand it, because I only got half of that, to be honest. But
it's a start.
Yeah, it's a start. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Steve.
Okay, mate. Bye.
And next time on the Debunking Economics podcast, we're going to look at information and economics. Of course, economics is based on information. In theory, equal information to everyone, but that's not how it works. So if we had more information, would we have less inequality? That's the question next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll see you then. Thanks for listening.